Monday, April 21st, 2025, a really significant day. The world is marking the passing of Pope Francis, aged 88. It's a moment with, well, profound historical and religious weight.
It really is. And the news coming just the day after Easter Sunday, it closes a truly remarkable chapter, not just for the Catholic Church, but, globally.
Definitely. So for this deep dive, we've got a collection of news reports, some analyses you shared, looking at this huge event.
Right.
And our aim today is to, well, unpack it all. Look at Pope Francis's passing, his life, his papacy, the immediate reaction, and, what might come next. We're hoping to pull out some of those maybe surprising details, those insights that give us the bigger picture.
Okay. And one thing that jumps out straight away from the reports is how consistent and fast the confirmation was. Cardinal Kevin Farrell, he's the Vatican Camerlengo, basically the interim administrator of the Vatican when there's no pope. He announced the death from the Domo Santa Marta.
7:35 a.m. local time.
7:35 a.m. And the cause, it seems consistently reported as complications from double pneumonia. This followed a, pretty long hospitalization, 38 days.
Wow.
That started back in mid-February after a respiratory crisis.
Wow, 38 days. That really underscores how serious his final illness was. And you mentioned the Domo Santa Marta, that's where he lived, right?
Yeah.
Not the Apostolic Palace.
Exactly. Which itself was a statement, about his desire for a simpler, more communal style.
Yeah, it really was. And this struck me too, that really long hospitalization, and then he made that final public appearance, the Easter blessing in St. Peter's Square, just one day before he passed.
It says a lot, doesn't it, about his commitment, perhaps his sheer will to fulfill his duties right to the very end.
It really does. It makes you think.
And, if we look back at his life, his whole story is full of these kinds of moments, personal challenges, but also this incredible outward focus. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, born in Buenos Aires, 1936. Parents were Italian immigrants. His father, an accountant, mother, a homemaker. He was the eldest of 5 kids, grew up in a, working class area. That background must have shaped him profoundly.
Absolutely. A working class perspective from Argentina that grounds you differently, I imagine. And one detail from the sources that really stood out for me was his early education. He got a technical certificate as a chemical technician.
Yeah, in high school. It's not the usual path for a future pope, is it?
Not at all. A science background. You have to wonder if that sort of analytical thinking maybe played a role later on in how he approached problems.
That's a really interesting thought. And then another major event early on, at 21, he had severe pneumonia. So severe they had to remove part of one lung.
Wow.
That could easily be seen as a pivotal moment, maybe deepening his spiritual journey, certainly testing his resilience.
For sure. And before he even entered the seminary, he wasn't just, praying and studying. He had actual jobs, right? Like regular jobs.
He did. The sources mention him working as a janitor and even briefly as a nightclub bouncer.
A bouncer, from bouncer to pope. That's quite the trajectory. It gives him a connection to, ordinary life that maybe not all leaders have.
I think so. It likely gave him a unique perspective on people's everyday struggles and concerns. Then came his formal religious training. Immaculata Concepcion Seminary, then joining the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, in 1958.
The Jesuits, okay.
Studied humanities in Chile, got a licentiate in philosophy. He even taught literature and psychology for a while, shows a real breadth of interest.
Yeah, it does.
Ordained a priest in 1969, then finished his Jesuit formation in Spain, took final vows in 73. So you see this blend, practical life experience, deep intellectual study, and spiritual formation.
So he has this strong foundation in Argentina within the Jesuits. How did that lead towards, the Vatican?
Well, after his final vows, he moved into significant leadership within the order. Master of Novices, then Provincial Superior for Argentina and Uruguay until 79, then Rector and Theology Professor at the Collegio Maximo. His move into the wider church hierarchy started in 1992, appointed Auxiliary Bishop of Buenos Aires, then Coadjutor Archbishop in 97, and finally Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1998.
And it was there, wasn't it, that he got that nickname Father Jorge, really emphasizing his connection to the community, especially in the poorer neighborhoods.
Exactly. Building chapels, speaking out against injustice. You can really see the seeds of his papacy being sown right there, that focus on the margins.
Those themes were emerging early.
Very much so. And that work led to him being made a cardinal by Pope John Paul II in 2001. He also led the Argentine Bishops' Conference for 6 years, participated in the 2005 conclave that elected Benedict XVI.
Right. He was already a significant figure then.
Yes. And then came March 13th, 2013, elected pope at 76, took the name Francis, honoring St. Francis of Assisi, and the historical significance. I mean, first Jesuit pope, first from the Americas, first non-European in, over 1,000 years?
It really was historic on multiple levels. The speed of that rise through all those different roles is quite something when you look at it laid out like that.
It is indeed. Very noteworthy.
And his papacy, right from the start, it felt different, didn't it? It had these very distinct characteristics.
It absolutely did. That decision to live in the Domus Santa Marta, the guest house, instead of the apostolic palace, using simpler cars, that sent a powerful message immediately. Simplicity, humility.
Yeah, actions speaking louder than words, in a way.
And then his writings. The first big one, Evangelii Gaudium in 2013. The joy of the gospel. It was almost a mission statement, wasn't it? Calling for a church that goes out, focuses on the marginalized, critiquing economic inequality.
That really set the tone. And then Laudato Si in 2015, the encyclical on the environment.
A landmark document, linking climate change and environmental protection directly to social justice. That was huge. It brought a powerful moral voice to that whole debate.
Hugely influential. You saw reactions everywhere. And then Amoris Laetitia, The Joy of Love in 2016, that one sparked a lot of debate, didn't it? On family life, opening doors for divorced and remarried Catholics in some situations.
It certainly did generate significant discussion within the church. And beyond those major encyclicals, we should also mention Gaudete et Exsultate on holiness, Fratelli Tutti on fraternity and social friendship, and the follow-up to Laudato Si, Laudate Deum, another key feature, was how he reshaped the College of Cardinals.
How so?
By consistently appointing cardinals from, outside Europe, from developing nations, from dioceses on the peripheries, places that maybe hadn't had a cardinal before. It was a very deliberate move towards a more globally representative church leadership.
That's a very concrete way to change the church's perspective, making the leadership reflect the flock more. And his travels seem to follow that pattern too, right?
Exactly. Lots of focus on smaller Catholic communities, visiting places previous popes hadn't reached, and a huge emphasis on interfaith dialogue throughout his trips and his papacy.
Okay. And internally, within the Vatican itself, reforms were a big theme too.
Yes, definitely. Efforts to modernize the Curia, the Vatican bureaucracy, tackling financial transparency, which had been a recurring issue, and of course addressing the clergy's sexual abuse crisis. He brought in new protocols, significantly. He abolished the use of the pontifical secret, basically confidentiality rules, in abuse cases.
That was a major step.
It was. And alongside all this, his constant engagement with contemporary issues, social justice, poverty, climate change, migration, peace efforts. Now, it's also true, and the sources reflect this, that some actions caused controversy. You mentioned Amoris Laetitia. There were also the guidelines allowing blessings for same-sex couples, the agreement with China on appointing bishops. These generated strong reactions, both positive and negative.
Right. And it's important as we talk about these that we're just reflecting what the sources say, recording on the different perspectives without taking a side ourselves.
Precisely. Our goal is just to map out the landscape of his papacy as it's been reported.
Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper into some of those really defining themes. Social justice and poverty, that feels like it was right at the core for him.
Absolutely central. You can trace it right back to his roots in Argentina, his experience there, and the influence of Latin American liberation theology, though he perhaps had his own distinct take on it. He consistently critiqued aspects of, unchecked capitalism, consumerism, and he was such a powerful advocate for migrants and refugees, coining that phrase, the globalization of indifference.
That phrase really cut through. And Laudato Si on the environment, it wasn't just about trees and animals, was it? It was deeply tied to that social justice theme.
Exactly. He framed it as care for our common home, linking the cry of the earth with the cry of the poor. It presented this compelling moral case for urgent action, for a shift away from fossil fuels. It really established him as maybe the leading global moral voice on climate change.
Although, as you noted, there were some critiques, perhaps about the church stepping into scientific areas.
Yes, those points were raised in some quarters, which is fair to acknowledge, but the overall impact was undeniable.
And the interfaith dialogue piece, that seemed like a constant effort.
It really was. He actively worked to build bridges with other religions, made historic visits to Muslim-majority countries like Egypt, the UAE, Iraq, and that culminated in the 2019 document on human fraternity, signed with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, a major statement promoting peace and coexistence.
Widely praised, though I recall some within the church had theological questions or concerns.
That's true. As with many of his initiatives, it prompted discussion about tradition and dialogue, but the overall aim of fostering understanding was clear.
Okay. And turning back inside the church, those reforms, bureaucracy, finances, the abuse crisis.
He certainly pushed hard on those fronts, trying to streamline the Vatican structures, push for greater financial accountability, and implement stricter measures against abuse, emphasizing both justice for victims and pastoral care. Other significant moves included formally changing the church's teaching to declare the death penalty inadmissible under all circumstances.
Right, that was a definitive shift.
And his strong condemnation of nuclear weapons. Then there was the deal with China on bishop appointments, a hugely complex diplomatic effort aimed at unifying the church there, but also very controversial, with critics worrying about compromises with the government. It highlighted the resistance he sometimes faced from more conservative groups within the church who were wary of some of these changes.
So, a papacy marked by bold moves, significant outreach, but also internal debate and some resistance.
That seems a fair summary, yes.
So, when the news of his passing broke, what did the global reaction look like based on our sources?
It was immediate and really vast, across the board. Religious leaders from many different faiths sent condolences, acknowledging his work on Christian unity and interfaith relations. The Archbishop of York, for instance, mentioned his deep awareness of Christian divisions. The Russian Orthodox Church credited him with really advancing their dialogue with Catholics. The Church of England spoke of his positive, lasting impact.
A lot of respect there from other Christian denominations and faiths. What about political leaders?
Oh, absolutely. Statements poured in from capitals around the world. The White House, Italy's Prime Minister Meloni, President Zelensky in Ukraine, even President Putin in Russia, President Macron in France, just to name a few.
And what were the common themes in those tributes?
Recurring themes were his commitment to justice, to peace, advocating for the poor and marginalized, his defense of human dignity, and very prominently, his voice on climate change. The reaction wasn't just words either. Spain declared national mourning. Soccer games were postponed in Italy. The bells of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris tolled for him. The Eiffel Tower lights were switched off. Real, tangible signs of respect.
That really shows the kind of global stature he had. It wasn't just within the religious sphere.
Not at all. He was a major figure on the world stage.
So now, with his passing, these very specific Vatican protocols kick in for the period between popes, the interregnum.
That's right. It starts with an Ovendial 9 days of official mourning, with special masses and prayer services. Cardinal Farrell, as Camerlengo, takes over the day-to-day administration of the Holy See. His first official duty is to formally verify the Pope's death, which he did in the Domus Santa Marta Chapel.
Okay.
Then the preparations begin for the Pope's body to lie in state. Dressed in papal vestments, he'll be brought to St. Peter's Basilica for public viewing for the faithful to pay their respects. There are also symbolic acts. The Pope's ring of the fisherman, unique to him, is ritually destroyed or defaced. And the papal apartments in the Apostolic Palace are formally sealed.
Right, sealing off that personal space.
Mhm.
And the funeral itself, that's a huge event.
It is. Usually happens within 4 to 6 days after the death. It's expected to be held in St. Peter's Square, a massive open-air service. The Dean of the College of Cardinals, currently Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, typically presides over the funeral mass.
And I read something interesting about Pope Francis's own wishes for his burial.
Yes, this is quite notable. He apparently expressed a wish not to be buried in the traditional Vatican grottos beneath St. Peter's, but rather in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. He also requested a simpler coffin, just plain wood. And the funeral rites themselves have been revised slightly under Francis, reportedly to emphasize the Pope's role as Bishop of Rome, as a pastor, perhaps a bit less emphasis on the monarchical aspects.
Interesting deviations from tradition there. And then, after the mourning period and the funeral, all eyes turn to the Sistine Chapel.
Exactly. The papal conclave to elect his successor. It's mandated to begin between 15 and 20 days after the Pope's death.
And who gets to vote?
The electors are all the cardinals who were under the age of 80 on the day the Pope died. They gather, sequestered, inside the Sistine Chapel.
Right, locked in, essentially.
Pretty much. They hold rounds of secret balloting. To be elected Pope, a candidate needs a 2/3 majority. After each unsuccessful vote, or pair of votes, the ballots are burned with chemicals to produce black smoke. When a pope is finally elected, they burn the ballots with chemicals that produce the famous white smoke, the fumata bianca.
That iconic signal. And inevitably, speculation starts immediately about who might be the next pope. What names are coming up in the reports?
Well, as always, it's speculation, but some names are consistently mentioned. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle from the Philippines is often seen as representing a continuation of Francis's progressive focus. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the current Secretary of State, is viewed perhaps as a more moderate, experienced Vatican insider. Cardinal Peter Turkson from Ghana, very strong on social justice issues, and then perhaps representing a more conservative viewpoint, Cardinal Peter Erdu from Hungary. But there are others too, of course.
And does the fact that Pope Francis appointed so many of the current electors a clear majority, I believe, does that heavily influence the outcome?
It certainly shifts the balance, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He's appointed cardinals who, you might assume, share at least some aspects of his vision for the church. But conclaves are complex. Cardinals vote according to their conscience, considering the needs of the church now. National alliances, theological perspectives, personalities, it all plays a role. It's not predictable.
No, never entirely predictable. So, looking beyond the immediate succession, what do you think Pope Francis's legacy will be? What's the long-term impact likely to be?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think his legacy will really be seen in the direction the church takes next. Will his successors continue the focus on social issues, the push for inclusivity, the reforms of Vatican governance? Or will there be a shift, maybe a consolidation or even pullback in some areas? His impact on how the church engages with poverty, with the climate crisis, with other faiths, that's been immense.
It feels like he's really changed the church's public face and priorities.
He has. And the cardinals he created, they will be shaping the church for decades to come, whether through electing the next pope or in their own leadership roles.
And what about the church's role in the wider world, in global affairs?
Well, under Francis, the papacy has been a really significant player in international diplomacy, mediating conflicts, advocating for human rights, pushing for environmental action. That deep commitment to interfaith dialogue has also built bridges. The next pope inherits that powerful global platform. How they choose to use it, which issues they prioritize, will be critical. Will they continue Francis's style of direct engagement on global ethical issues?
Lots to watch there. So just to wrap up our deep dive today, we've covered the news of Pope Francis's passing, looked back at his journey from Buenos Aires to the papacy, explored those key themes, social justice, Laudato Si's, interfaith work, internal reforms, and the controversies too. We've seen the huge global reaction.
Right, the protocol's now underway, the Novendial, the upcoming funeral.
And the impending conclave to choose his successor. It's been quite a sweep through a momentous life in papacy.
It certainly has, a period of really significant change and engagement for the church.
So maybe a final thought for our listeners to ponder. As the world does watch those cardinals gather in Rome, what do you think is the single biggest challenge facing the next leader of the Catholic Church? And thinking about Pope Francis's very distinct legacy, how might their approach to that challenge be different? Something to really consider as one era ends and another begins.